You have to have
Yeah,
when
it
it's
is now.
square.
Oh, it is? Okay. All right, so let me restart. Hello, I am Tighe. I'm a college student at UMass Dartmouth. And so this is a presentation that I've been working on over the summer. And it's about shark conservation. So in this study that was being done by Greg Schkommel, which is this gentleman right over here, he tagged a bunch of great whites off the coast of Cape Cod. And for the past few years, he's been doing research to see their movements and stuff. And so not a lot was really known about the great whites before the Atlantic great whites before this study was done. We kind of knew that they kind of inhabited a range from like Newfoundland to the Gulf of Mexico, and that they were close to our coastline. But besides that, not really much was known. But Greg, he's been tagging these sharks with these satellite tags right over here. And so every time that these sharks, their fins break the surface of the water for more than a minute, the tag sends information to a satellite, and the satellite sends information to Greg and his team's computers. And so through this, they were actually able to find out a lot more about these sharks. They found out that these are highly migratory. And so I'm going to use 3 sharks in this study of his to kind of like help paint a picture of what we knew about their migrations to now what we know about them. And so the sharks are Catherine, Mary Lee, and Lydia. They are all adult female great whites. So now that we kind of know a little bit about the study itself, we can kind of get into some of the sharks' biology before we can really get into like their movements and stuff. So do any of you have kind of like an idea about what this kind of color swirls might represent? Yeah.
Body heat.
Heat is correct, but not body heat necessarily. This is seasonal temperatures of the ocean. So these sharks, this does tie in with their body heat though. These sharks do like to inhabit a certain range, but they're actually part of a family of sharks called mackerel sharks. And these guys are able to regulate their body temperature, so they're warm-blooded like you and me. And so being warm-blooded, they kind of need to, eat more than a shark that's cold-blooded about their same size would need to eat. And so in order to conserve energy and stuff, they kind of like to stay in a range between like this red zone and this green zone. So now that we kind of like understand a little bit about their biology, we can actually start to get into these tracks of these sharks. So every time that these dots change, it's going to represent 1 week's worth of movement for each of these sharks. Excuse me. So this first shark is Catherine, and she's kind of like what I'd like to call a typical great white. She spends like typical great white of what we thought of before the study was done. She spends a lot of her time along the coastline, moving between like Nova Scotia and Newfoundland to like the Gulf of Mexico. And so she'll kind of be in the Gulf of Mexico around like June-ish, which is coming up really quickly. She'll kind of like make her way down, swim around here for a little while, and then loop her way back up, and she'll be back into like our waters around like October or so. And so she spends most of her time, again, like close to the coastline, very rarely kind of going out to open ocean areas. And I'm just going to speed this up so you can kind of get a better idea of her migrations. When she moves north, in particular, like through this area, she moves really, really quickly, and I'll explain that in a little while. Because all these sharks kind of follow, like, at least that's the only thing that's really similar between each of their migrations is when they move north, like through this area. And so you saw she kind of like went into the open ocean around here, and then went up into like the Newfoundland, Nova Scotia area in Canada.
They follow the food?
Yeah, so I'll also get to that in a little bit. This presentation builds up to, to all information and stuff. So our next shark is Mary Lee, and she's also, like kind of typical great white. She spends a lot of her time close to the coastline, although she does kind of go off into the open ocean, kind of like into this little area off to like Bermuda, which she's doing right now. That kind of is the extent of her open ocean area. But unlike, yes?
What's with the multiple dots moving all around?
So that represents, so each of these dots is like every time they change is like a week's worth of movement. So some weeks she does a lot more movement, and that's represented by the different amount of dots. So every time her fin breaks the surface of the water, it's represented as one dot. So if her fin breaks the surface of the water multiple times during a week, there's going to be multiple dots. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So Mary Lee, unlike Catherine and our other shark, Lydia, she actually likes to spend quite a bit of time in one particular area, which she's doing right now. She somehow loves Georgia. I don't know if it's the Georgia peaches that she really likes, but my best guess is it's a good feeding ground for her. And so at one point she spends actually about like a year in right off the coast of Georgia. And so she, like I said with Catherine, she has like a very close coastline kind of migration. I'm just gonna speed this up because that's like where she's spending all of her time around Georgia. And she goes like north and south, not as far north as Catherine does, but and not as far as south, but she definitely, you know, has a northern and southerly migration, as well as spending a lot of time in like one particular space. So our final shark, Lydia, is unlike the other two. She doesn't spend a lot of time near the coastline. She actually is very oceanic. So she spends a large amount of her time in these open ocean environments, kind of like going all around, really following, there's this current that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But when was the last time anyone's had a geography course? I like to ask this because there's this next part where she really follows a very specific geographic location.
Many years.
Okay, yeah, it's been a while for me too. So a little bit of a refresher course. This right here is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And so it's where the North Atlantic continental plate meets the European and African continental plate. And throughout this area, there's a large amount of magnetic fields. And so we're about to see Lydia follow right along that field. So sharks, they have a sixth sense that we don't have. They're able to detect electrical and magnetic fields. And so what Lydia just did was she keyed in on that magnetic field that's being thrown off, because that's like a break in the Earth's crust. So there's like a lot of magnetic energy going on in that area. And she's able to detect that, and she uses that kind of like as a navigation point. And so at one point, I think it's coming up now basically, Lydia disappears for about a year. We don't know exactly what happened. My best guess is that, so the shark needs to surface the water for over a minute in order for the tag to send information to the satellite. And so I'm guessing that either she was at the surface for like less than a minute at a time, or is like right below the surface of the waters, or is diving down really, really deep. And so, so for about a year, we're not able to track her because she doesn't really surface the ocean. And so when Greg used a different kind of tag for some other sharks, it was able to detect light, depth, and temperature. And so he found that when these sharks are going to these open ocean areas, they're what we would call oscillating, which means going from the surface of the water down really deep really quickly, then back up to the surface really quickly. And so his best guess is, you know, they're doing that for like a feeding behavior when they're in these open ocean environments, because all the food is probably down really, really deep, like deep sea fish, deep sea squid. And so when she's in these open ocean areas, that's my best guess with what Lydia's doing. And so I'm just going to speed this up a little bit because there's not too much left for her, her migration. But each of these sharks was tagged in about like 2012, and the tags naturally released around 2016. So it was about like 4 years worth of data for these guys, which is pretty impressive, because like 10 years ago we weren't able to do this kind of stuff. And so now we can kind of like talk about the ocean currents. So if you remember, I was saying before how these sharks, they're warm-blooded. They like to save as much energy as they can. So when all these guys were moving northward, they really seemed to follow this Gulf Stream right over here. And so Lydia in particular, it dumps her out like right over here before she starts her leg of journey going like south without like having a lot of current for her to follow. And that's, you know, like right before she goes into like that fault line area, which is around here. And so I'm guessing these sharks, you know, they're using these like currents to kind of like help them save energy and stuff. But it's not confirmed yet by scientists because none of them have really like seen their data in like this format before. So I'm just guessing based off what I'm seeing. Once like scientists actually do look at this kind of stuff, they can tell me if I'm right or wrong. But based on this data, it looks like they're really following these currents, to help them save energy, especially Lydia in particular, before she goes off into this area of ocean where there's not a lot of currents for her to follow. And so, getting to the point about food, this section right over here represents the abundance of species in a given area in the ocean. So all along the coastline of the eastern seaboard, we have a pretty productive area when it comes to different numbers of species. So when Catherine's kind of like swimming around throughout her migration, she's always kind of got like something for her to eat because she's in this really dense area of species diversity. Mary Lee, pretty much too, it's a little bit less when she goes out into like this area over here, but there's still quite a bit for her to eat from. But Lydia, when she goes out into these open ocean areas, she doesn't have a lot for her to like choose from. Except if you remember that big fault line in the middle of the earth, that happens to be an area where there's a lot more species diversity. And so my best guess is because, based on like all the evidence I'm seeing with this presentation, just before, she's like going off into this area where there's not a lot of ocean currents, it dumps her off, like the Gulf Stream dumps her off right around here. And that just so happens to be an area where there's a lot more species diversity than the areas that she's been traveling. And so I'm guessing she's using that to like, fuel up before she goes off on these long migrations where there's not a lot for her to choose from for her eating. And so to me, that's like a really cool thing because, we don't know too much about these sharks besides like the data we're getting from their migration. So we can't really tell what they're doing. But when you put like these,
Do they always hunt, or do they?
So they're opportunistic feeders. So whenever there's a chance for them to eat, they're gonna eat. Sometimes they go to a certain area, like around here in New England, they come here for like the seals and stuff because that's really rich food for like calories and stuff. The seals are predominantly made of fat, And so it all depends on like where the shark is.
I mean, if it takes a kill, will it kill every day?
So
Hunt every day?
I'm not entirely sure about that.
Because sometimes you get
because I'm not exactly an expert, but I know that during times when there's a large abundance of food, they're going to take every opportunity they can to eat. So and they'll like stock up on their fat reserves, especially if they're going off in these long distance migrations, because they're not going to know when their next meal opportunity is going to be. So with all that being said, why is all this information really important? So if you look right over here, this shows all the data from the 3 sharks over the course of 4 years. Catherine's in red, Mary Lee's in green, Lydia's in yellow. And it does show like a very coastal species of shark, but it also shows that they're highly migratory, doing large distance migrations. Yeah.
Is there a certain spawning area for them? Or?
They have been found. There's been like a lot of like juvenile white sharks found off of like the coast of New York and New Jersey. They think that might be a pupping ground for them, but I'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
Yes.
Why do they have names?
So it's just easier to distinguish them, like when they're using like their tags and stuff. So they're able to be like, oh, okay, so here's Lydia. She's migrating in this area. Catherine's over there. It just helps them realize which shark is which.
Someone on land?
No, sorry. The sphere isn't totally lined up today. I did my best to kind of get it lined up as much as possible, but there was actually, while I was like sorting through this data, a couple of like little abnormalities, I guess you could say, where there were sharks. It said that the sharks appeared in places like, the Midwest and stuff, and
we know that can't happen.
that was, unless these guys sprouted legs and like ran really, really quickly to the middle of the American continent, then it was just a glitch. But that's kind of what happens sometimes with data. You know, it's not always perfect. But yeah, this is the data for these 3 sharks over the course of 4 years. And so this is really important in terms of conservation efforts. Yes?
Is there a theory of that sharks, white sharks, will go into fresh water?
So white sharks can't. They can go into, I guess, like brackish water, but not for very long. It's bull sharks that are the ones that can live in fresh water.
Right.
Because they have, they're able to like retain salinity in like their urine or something like that, so they're able to maintain like a homeostasis kind of balance.
Can it also live in seawater?
Yeah, yeah. So
I've read the story of the little boy getting
so
devoured in, you know.
The shark that really
that
actually
creek.
inspired the story of Jaws was actually probably a bull shark, because I think the actual events were like in 1920s or something like that, where there was like a string of shark attacks or something like that, and there was like one in the river, one at the mouth of the river, one on a beach, all in the course of like a couple of days.
Yeah.
And they caught, I think they caught a great white that had like a human arm in it, or something like that. But it's been a while since I've looked into that, because I did a paper on shark attacks in like high school, but that was a while ago. But anyways, in terms of conservation and stuff, this is really important, because when these sharks are close to our coastlines, we're able to, you know, like study them. They've been federally protected since 1997 and locally protected since 2005. So when they're in our waters, you know, they're easy to track. Science can like easily keep track of their populations. Could you hold your questions till the end? All right, great, thank you. Almost there. It's a lot harder to protect these guys when they're in these international waters, because there's no strict regulations to protect them. It's harder to keep track of their populations, because I like to make the analogy like it's finding a needle in a haystack, but it's finding one shark in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So it's really hard to, you know, like keep track of their populations, and it's basically impossible to protect them from things like long lining and commercial fisheries and bycatch. This kind of represents right over here the extent of their federal protection in U.S. waters. It's like 200 nautical miles, I think, is where it is before it goes into international waters. So once they kind of get past like this point, these sharks are under threat from commercial fisheries and stuff like that. And so sharks, they're what we would call a apex predator or a keystone species. And so what that means is they're really important for the health of the environment. They help eat like sick and dying animals, and they help keep certain species in balance, so that not one species gets like too overpopulated or too underpopulated and stuff. So I like to use the example, you know, like the seals around here recently. There's a lot more seals, and that's kind of like affecting like the sports fishing industry and stuff. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing, you know, like a large amount of white sharks coming in, and that will probably help balance out the seal population a little bit. But there has been a couple of instances recently where white sharks are attacking like fish on like a fishing line. Mm-hmm. So like just before someone brings their fish into the boat, I've seen a couple of instances where there's a great white like biting a striped bass like in half, like right at the side of the boat. But that's just simply them doing what they're meant to do, because they see that fish as a sick and dying individual. Mm-hmm. So they're going after that because, you know, that's what sharks are supposed to do. And they've been doing this job since like 400 million years ago. They've survived 2 of the biggest extinction events in the history of this planet. And the only real threat has been the last 50 years or so, due to overfishing and stuff. So sharks are very slow to mature and reach an age where they can breed. And so, and they only give birth to very few young at a time. Great whites, in fact, have one of the longest pregnancies of any animal. They have a pregnancy of 2 years, which is a really, really long time. They only give birth to 5 juvenile at a time. And all these sharks are adult female sharks that I presented. So they're the ones that we really need to protect, because they're the ones that are going to be like helping to rebuild the population of these sharks. And so if we know that these large females are going out into these open international waters, we really need to see like what we can do to protect them and stuff. And so in order to you know, if you guys want to do further research, you can go on to places like OSearch, NOAA, and Atlantic White Shark Conservation. You can become more informed, you can help educate other people, and there's ways to, you know, like reach out to local and state officials to see if you can cause like some kind of change in laws for international protection. If you guys have any questions about sharks, I'd be happy to answer. I'll take that. Thank you very much for recording for me.
They do birth.